The sound of shattering glass split the ballroom like a gunshot. 100 crystal shards scattered across polished marble, catching the chandelier light and flashing like frozen sparks. For a moment, the music died, the conversation stopped, and all of Manhattan's elite froze mid-sip. Every pair of eyes turned toward the woman kneeling on the floor. Her trembling hands swept broken fragments into her apron, her dark skin illuminated cruelly beneath the golden glow of the ceiling lights. From the far side of the room, a man's voice rang out, thick with arrogance and bourbon. "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry my son to you." The words dripped with mockery, heavy enough to hang in the air long after they were spoken. He was William Thompson III, real estate tycoon, patron of the arts, and the kind of man who thought humiliation was entertainment. He stood tall, champagne glass raised, smirk carved deep into his face. Laughter erupted in scattered bursts around him. But the woman Kesha Williams, 35, contract cleaner for just 3 weeks, didn't laugh. She stayed on the ground, her hands steadying as if every shard she touched was a choice, a memory, a decision. To the crowd, she was nobody. But in that silence, the weight of her calm radiated, unsettling those who thought she would simply bow her head and retreat. And then, with a voice as clear and sharp as cut glass, she whispered, "I accept." The ballroom gasped, the shock spread like wildfire. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some whispered, others covered their mouths in mock surprise, but most grinned, relishing the cruelty. This was supposed to be a joke, a spectacle, a way to remind everyone of the hierarchy, the powerful at the top, the invisible at the bottom. Jonathan Thompson, William's 28-year-old son, stepped forward, embarrassment coloring his face. "Dad, stop, this is ridiculous." But William ignored him, circling the center of the room like a showman on stage. "No, no, let's continue. Let's test if she can even move to the beat. Imagine it, my son marrying a cleaning lady." The laughter swelled. Kesha finally rose, brushing her apron smooth, her eyes locking on William. She didn't look broken. She didn't look humiliated. Instead, there was something unexplainable, a steady, unwavering calm that unsettled even those who'd laughed the loudest. "What did you say?" William asked, suddenly unsure he'd heard right. "I said I accept your challenge," Kesha repeated, "and when I dance better than your wife, you'll keep your word, in front of everyone." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. The orchestra faltered. Even Victoria Thompson, William's wife and Manhattan's self-appointed queen of ballroom, stiffened. She was known for her elite dance lessons, her trophies, her posture as sharp as her disdain. She stepped forward with a venomous smile. "Darling," she sneered, "surely you don't expect me to lower myself to compete with her." William chuckled darkly. "Oh, don't be modest. You won Club Waltz last year. That should be enough for this demonstration." The mockery deepened. Bets were placed. Glasses clinked. The air thickened with cruelty disguised as entertainment. But in the shadows, Kesha's eyes burned, not with fear, but with something no one could name, something they hadn't seen in years. Because what none of them knew was that 15 years ago, under another name, Kesha had commanded ovations on the world's grandest stages. And tonight, in this hall of arrogance and prejudice, the legend they thought long dead was about to awaken. She turned her head slightly, just enough to notice the security chief watching her closely. He knew, she could tell from his stare, but would he reveal her past before she chose to reveal it herself? The music was about to start. The bets had been placed. The crowd was hungry for her failure. Kesha closed her eyes, and in that brief, trembling silence before the first note struck, she whispered to herself the words she hadn't spoken aloud in 15 years. "Not this time." The orchestra lifted their bows, and the room held its breaths. Cliffhanger, the bowstrings quivered, the first notes of the waltz rising like a question into the heavy silence. Kesha stood at the edge of the dance floor, her body perfectly still, every muscle coiled with memory. Around her, laughter buzzed like flies, cruel and insistent, but fatting with every beat of the orchestra's strings. She wasn't in that ballroom anymore. She was 15 years younger, under glittering lights of another kind, in a theater packed to the rafters. She was Kesha Marrow then, the American National Ballet's shining star, leaping across the stage, as though gravity had been invented only to show she could defy it. But tonight wasn't that stage. Tonight she stood on a marble floor in a maid's uniform, facing a sea of smirks, with William Thompson's money-soaked arrogance dripping down like poisoned honey. Her apron still bore dust from broken glass. Her hands still trembled faintly from humiliation. And yet, as the music unfolded, her eyes carried something that unsettled even the cruelest hearts: resolve. Across from her, Victoria Thompson warmed up with elegant stretches, each movement exaggerated, theatrical, designed to remind the crowd of her trophies and lessons in society standing. She radiated confidence, but it was brittle. Kesha saw it. Years of training gave her the eye to recognize weakness, even beneath polish. Victoria's posture was wrong, her lines forced. She wasn't dancing, she was performing for applause, and that difference meant everything. The guests whispered, bets exchanged hands like playing cards. 500 she doesn't make it through the song, one man muttered. 1,000 says she trips in the first 30 seconds, another replied. Each cruel bet piled like weights on the air, pressing down, daring Kesha to falter. Jonathan Thompson couldn't take his eyes off her. He didn't join the laughter, he didn't bet. He remembered her from 3 weeks ago, the only worker his father hadn't sneered at, the one who moved with quiet dignity even as she scrubbed the corners of his empire. Tonight, something flickered in his memory, something about the way she held herself, as though she was hiding more than a mop and bucket. Beside the bar, Marcus, the 60-year-old head of security, shifted his weight. His dark eyes narrowed with recognition. 15 years ago, he had guarded the National Theater's side doors. The same night critics wrote of a performance so transcendent they swore the ballerina had left her soul suspended in the air. He had seen her then. He was seeing her now, and the weight of injustice made his jaw tighten. The music grew louder, violins cutting sharper. Victoria stepped forward first, claiming the spotlight. Her movements were graceful enough for polite applause. She twirled, stretched, smiled, her gown glittering beneath chandeliers. To the untrained eye, she was poised, confident, even skilled. To Kesha, it was hollow, a skeleton dressed in satin. And yet the crowd clapped politely. They knew their roles, to flatter wealth, to applaud privilege, to pretend skill where only money spoke. William grinned, clinking glasses with a guest. See, my wife doesn't even need to try. This will be over in minutes. But when Victoria finished her final turn, bowing dramatically, and the polite applause echoed through the hall, all eyes turned to Kesha. The orchestra reset the waltz. Silence settled thick. William smirked, leaning toward her. When you trip, remember to apologize before you crawl out of here. Kesha met his eyes with unnerving calm. When I don't, she whispered, remember to keep your word. The first note struck again. She moved. At first, it was nothing extraordinary, just a small step, a slow sway, a controlled movement. The crowd chuckled. Relief flashed across William's face. She's timid, he muttered. She'll collapse soon enough. But then her arms lifted, her spine lengthened. The sway became a glide, the step a turn, the turn a leap so fluid it seemed impossible. Her apron, humble and worn, swept through the air like silk. Every line of her body sang with grace. The ballroom stilled. She wasn't performing for them. She wasn't dancing for William's challenge. She was reclaiming what life had stolen. Each step carried 15 years of grief, every pirouette heavy with loss, each extension screaming resilience. Her movements were precise yet raw, breaking through the marble hall's arrogance like cracks in glass. Marcus lifted his phone, discreetly recording. He knew what this meant, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, silenced, laughed at. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had never seen anything like it, not at galas, not at the polished recitals his mother taught. This wasn't ballroom, it was truth made flesh, defiance carved into motion. A murmur ran through the guests. The men who had bet against her fell silent, their champagne forgotten. The women who had smirked now whispered urgently, unsure whether to laugh or applaud. Something ancient had shifted in the room, a gravity none of them could deny. William's smile faltered. This is impossible, he muttered under his breath. The orchestra swelled. Kesha spun, her apron flaring like wings. For 1 second, the chandelier seemed to dim, the world shrinking to her alone, and when she landed, every glass in the room trembled. Victoria's face flushed red, her smirk gone, replaced with tight-jawed fury. She knew. She had just been outdanced, outshone, obliterated in front of her entire social kingdom. Kesha didn't stop. She danced on, eyes closed, body remembering what her soul had never forgotten. For 15 years she had hidden this fire, and now it poured out, uncontrollable, unstoppable. And then, a woman in the crowd gasped. Wait, I've seen this before. Her hand trembled as she pointed. Those movements, they're not ballroom, they're ballet, classical ballet. Heads turned, a murmur surged, recognition blooming. Another whispered, it's her, my God, it's her. William froze, her, who? The woman's voice cracked with awe. Kesha Marrow, the ballerina who disappeared after the accident. The hall erupted, gasps, exclamations, disbelief. The legend who had vanished, who the world thought broken, erased, was here in a maid's uniform, tearing open their prejudice with every step. Kesha opened her eyes. And this time she looked straight at William. Cliffhanger, the revelation rippled through the ballroom like thunder rolling through a canyon. Whispers turned into gasps, gasps into frantic murmurs, and in seconds the crowd no longer looked at Kesha as a maid or a cleaner. They looked at her as a ghost resurrected from the ashes of memory. Kesha Merrow, the name hung in the air, trembling with awe. Some guests repeated it like a prayer, others as if saying it aloud would make the impossible real. They remembered newspaper headlines, glowing reviews, and then the sudden silence after the accident. They remembered the ballerina who had been called a force of nature, the one who vanished after tragedy stole her future. And now here she was, dancing again, not on a theater stage, but in the center of a marble ballroom, in an apron dusted with glass. William Thompson's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering at his feet. For once, the powerful tycoon looked small, his arrogance cracking like thin ice under too much weight. This was not the humiliation he had planned. He had wanted comedy, ridicule, a spectacle at someone else's expense. Instead, he had awakened a legend. But Kesha didn't stop. She spun, leaped, stretched into movements so precise, so impossibly graceful, the orchestra itself seemed to bend around her. Each note wrapped her like an old friend, carrying her body through muscle memory carved into bone and blood. She was no longer a maid, no longer broken. She was who she had always been. And with every movement, William's smirk dissolved further, replaced by something darker. Fear. Victoria Thompson, flushed red, stepped forward, her composure cracking. "This is ridiculous," she barked, her voice shrill against the violins. "She's cheating. This isn't ballroom, this is ballet." The crowd didn't look at Victoria. They weren't interested in excuses. Their eyes were locked on Kesha. Jonathan's breath caught as he lowered the phone that had been recording everything. He hadn't meant to, he just wanted proof of his father's cruelty, something private. But now he realized he had something far greater, the truth that could topple a kingdom of arrogance. Marcus, still filming discreetly, knew the same. The video would spread like wildfire, and when it did, William's empire, built on intimidation and power, would crumble. "Stop this nonsense," William roared suddenly, shoving through the guests. "Enough, you've had your fun, this charade ends now." But the orchestra didn't stop. The violins climbed higher, and Kesha, eyes closed, arms stretched, was untouchable. Each step she took widened the chasm between her dignity and William's humiliation. The guests weren't laughing anymore. They were witnessing history. And then she leapt. A grand jeté that sliced through the air, apron flowing like a banner of defiance. When she landed, her knee bent, her arms rising in perfect form, the applause burst before the music had even ended. It was thunderous, genuine. Kesha opened her eyes and looked directly at William. For the first time, his mouth hung open, speechless. The final note fell. Kesha ended in a pose that was both vulnerable and unbreakable, chest rising and falling as silence reclaimed the hall. The silence lasted only a moment before it cracked into a storm of clapping, shouting, whistling. "Bravo!" cried one woman, tears streaking her mascara. "Incredible!" shouted another, her voice breaking with awe. It wasn't just applause, it was redemption. Victoria turned on William, fury radiating. "You made a fool of me," she hissed, "of us." But William barely heard her. His empire of dominance, built on intimidation, was shaking beneath his feet. He tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat, dry and shallow. This means nothing," he stammered. "She's still just. "A legend," someone interrupted from the crowd. "A legend you mocked." William's face drained of color. Kesha stepped forward slowly, her eyes steady, voice soft, but carrying through every corner of the ballroom. "You said you'd marry me to your son if I danced better than your wife." Gasps the bet. The words he had shouted in arrogance were now chains around his neck. William straightened, rage bubbling. It was a joke, a drunken joke. Marcus lifted his phone high. "We have it recorded, every word, every condition." The guests murmured, scandal buzzing like electricity. William's empire wasn't cracking, it was collapsing. Jonathan stepped toward Kesha, voice steady. "Miss Merrow, I apologize for everything, for my father. You deserve better than this." Kesha's lips curved, faint but fierce. "Apologies aren't mine to demand," she said, "but truth is." She turned to William. "And the truth is, you underestimated me, and you underestimated the cost of your own arrogance." The crowd waited, holding their breath, sensing something monumental was about to break. William's hands shook, veins rising against his skin. "You think you've won something tonight? You think this little performance changes anything? I own this city. I own every contract, every deal, every person in this room." His voice rose, but it no longer sounded commanding, just desperate. Kesha tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, controlled. No, what you own is fear, but tonight, she glanced around at the crowd, fear doesn't seem to be working. For the first time, the guests looked at William not as a king, but as a fool. Their eyes betrayed disappointment, even disgust. Contracts meant nothing compared to humiliation broadcast in front of hundreds. William's jaw clenched, but before he could speak again, Jonathan stepped in front of Kesha, his voice firm. Father, it's over. William froze. His son, the heir he had groomed to obey, now stood against him. No, William whispered, don't you dare. But Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. Some things matter more than power. The guests gasped, Victoria hissed at her stepson, Marcus kept filming. And Kesha stood silently, watching the cracks in William's empire spread like fractures in glass. The night wasn't over, but the collapse had begun. Cliffhanger, the applause still echoed when William Thompson slammed his fist against the banquet table. Crystal glasses rattled, champagne spilled like golden blood, and the crowd fell silent. His face, flushed red with humiliation, twisted into a mask of fury. The tycoon who had once strutted like a king now looked cornered, his empire of dominance slipping through his fingers in front of the very people who upheld it. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperation. This ends now. But his words rang hollow. The applause had already told the truth. No amount of money, no title, no skyscraper could erase what they had witnessed. A maid had danced circles around his wife. A forgotten legend had risen from the ashes, and William Thompson, master of humiliation, had been humiliated himself. Kesha stood unmoved in the center of the ballroom, chest rising calmly, eyes steady as stone. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply watched, her silence sharper than any insult. That silence cut deeper than applause. It told him, you have lost. Jonathan stepped forward, his shoulders squared. Father, you can't undo this. The whole room saw it, and the recording. Shut up, William barked, spittle flying. You don't understand what's at stake. But Jonathan didn't flinch. His voice was steady, resolute. No, Dad, you don't. The orchestra still held their instruments in stunned silence. Guests shifted uneasily, some clutching their pearls, others pretending to check their phones. The air buzzed, not with music anymore, but with the sharp edge of a confrontation that had been years in the making. Victoria stormed forward, her gown sweeping across the marble. Do something, William, she hissed through gritted teeth. She humiliated me, she humiliated us. William's eyes darted wildly, searching for control he no longer had. Security, he barked, get her out. But no one moved. Marcus, standing near the edge of the dance floor, folded his arms. His deep voice cut through the tension like steel. No one's going anywhere, Mr. Thompson. This isn't your stage anymore. Gasps rippled, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. William's face contorted. You're fired, he spat at Marcus. But Marcus didn't blink. So are you just don't know it yet. The guests erupted into whispers, scandal electrifying the room. The mighty William Thompson, undone by his own arrogance, now defied not just by a maid, but by his own staff, his own son, his own guests. Kesha finally spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the hall. You said when I won you would keep your word. In front of everyone, you would admit your prejudice, and you would apologize. The words hit like a gavel strike. William's lips curled. You think I'll bow to you. You think I'll kneel to a nobody in rags. Her eyes softened, but her words were a blade. No, I think you'll kneel to the truth, and the truth is you were wrong. The crowd shifted, uneasy but captivated. Some nodded, others avoided eye contact, ashamed they had once laughed along, but none could deny it. The maid had become the judge. Jonathan took a step closer to his father, his voice sharp. It's over, admit it. William shook his head violently. Never, his voice cracked. I built everything, and you dare side with her against your own blood. Jonathan's jaw tightened, because she has more dignity in one step than you've had in your entire life. The ballroom gasped, a collective exhale of decades of whispered truths never spoken aloud. William's hands shook, veins bulging. He looked less like a mogul now, more like a man unraveling in front of an audience he could no longer control. Then his eyes narrowed, dark and dangerous. His voice dropped, low and venomous. You think this is over. You think one dance destroys me. You don't know who I am. Marcus lifted his phone higher. Everyone will, soon. William's gaze snapped to him. For a heartbeat, rage overtook reason. He lunged, grabbing for the phone. The crowd gasped as chairs toppled, glasses shattered. Marcus stood his ground, his grip like iron, but the chaos cracked the ballroom's fragile civility wide open. Victoria screamed. Jonathan rushed forward. Kesha didn't move. Her stillness was defiance itself. William wrestled, snarling like a cornered animal. "Delete it," he demanded. "Delete the damn recording." Marcus shoved him back, his voice booming. "It's already saved." The room exploded in gasps, flashes of phones, whispers turned to shouts. The scandal had broken free of William's control. Even if he smashed every phone in the room, the truth was already out. And William knew it. His eyes darted, his chest heaved, sweat poured down his temple. The predator was prey now, trapped in the cage he had built for others. Kesha stepped forward at last, her presence commanding silence once more. "You asked if I could move to the beat," she said, her voice steady as stone. "But the truth is, I don't dance to your beat. I never have. And tonight, the world won't either." The crowd erupted again, some clapping, others shouting in agreement. A few slipped out, phones in hand, already spreading what they'd seen. William staggered back, his face pale, eyes wild. His empire was bleeding in front of him. His family was slipping from his grasp. His power was crumbling with every breath. And then he reached for the champagne bottle. The guests froze, his hand trembled, but his eyes burned with reckless fire. He wasn't reaching for another drink. He was raising it above his head, toward Marcus. The ballroom screamed. Cliffhanger, the champagne bottle arced through the chandelier light, catching the golden glow before plunging downward like a weapon. Gasps ripped through the ballroom. Some guests screamed, others stumbled back, silk gowns and tuxedos scattering across the marble floor. Marcus braced, his eyes steady, his stance wide. He had faced worse than this: drunk moguls, violent executives, threats that came with guarding power. But tonight wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting her. The bottle shattered against his forearm, pain radiating as glass exploded into shards across the marble. The orchestra dropped their instruments in a discordant crash. The smell of champagne and sweat mingled with the iron tang of blood. William staggered back, panting, eyes wild. He no longer looked like a billionaire. He looked like a desperate man, stripped of his empire, reduced to violence when words failed. His empire had lived on intimidation, but now even his threats looked pitiful. Jonathan rushed forward, gripping his father's arm before he could strike again. "Stop, look at yourself." His voice cracked, equal parts rage and heartbreak. "You're destroying everything." But William twisted, veins pulsing in his neck. Everything was mine to destroy. His eyes burned, manic and unhinged, darting toward the crowd that had once worshipped him and now recoiled like he was contagious. And in that moment everyone knew. William Thompson III, Titan of Manhattan, was finished. Kesha stepped forward, her steps deliberate, unshaken. The crowd parted around her, silence following her like a tide. Her apron still clung to her waist, stained with dust, but her posture carried the grace of royalty. She stopped between William and Marcus, her eyes locking onto the man who had tried to break her. "You think power is in money," she said, her voice carrying through the trembling silence. "But power is truth, and tonight truth doesn't belong to you." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some raised their phones higher, recording every second. The story was already spreading beyond the marble walls, beyond the chandeliers. This humiliation wasn't going to stay contained. It was going viral, unstoppable, a wildfire fueled by prejudice exposed. Victoria's voice cut in, shrill and desperate. "William, stop. For God's sake, stop before it's too late." But William wrenched free from Jonathan's grip, his eyes darting wildly, sweat dripping down his temple. His empire had never been about truth, it had been about control, and control was slipping from him like sand through trembling hands. He pointed a trembling finger at Kesha, his voice breaking. You think you've beaten me. This room may applaud you, but out there, I still own everything. I'll bury you." Kesha didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her calmness a direct contrast to his unraveling fury. "You already buried me once," she said quietly. 15 years ago, when the world believed I was finished. But here I am, alive, dancing, and stronger than you'll ever be." The words cut deeper than glass. The crowd gasped, and Jonathan's eyes filled with something William had never seen directed at him before: pity. Marcus, clutching his bleeding forearm, lifted his phone again. "It's all recorded. Every word, every strike, every threat. You can't erase this." William's chest heaved, his shirt damp with sweat. He scanned the crowd. The same elite who had once cheered his arrogance now filmed his downfall. His kingdom wasn't applauding anymore. They were witnessing his execution by exposure. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice firm, echoing through the silence. "Father, you've lost, not to her, not to me, to yourself." The words landed like a final nail in the coffin. For a moment, William swayed as if the weight of his own collapse was crushing him. Then, in a last burst of defiance, he reached toward Jonathan, not for a hug, not for forgiveness, but to seize, to intimidate, to control one last time. But Jonathan caught his wrist midair, his grip unyielding. "No," he said firmly, "not anymore." Gasps echoed. It was the air rejecting the king, the sun breaking the chain. William's knees buckled slightly, his strength draining, his fury collapsing into something weaker, panic. Kesha's eyes softened, not in sympathy but in recognition. She had seen men like this before, powerful until stripped bare, their cruelty revealed as emptiness. She knew this moment wasn't just his end, it was her vindication, but just as the silence settled into something final, a sharp voice pierced the air. "Police, move aside." The double doors burst open. Two NYPD officers strode into the ballroom, their uniforms stark against the glittering gowns. The crowd parted instantly, murmurs rising, relief mixing with shock. Victoria's hands flew to her face. "Oh, God." William froze, his bravado collapsing into desperation. "No, no, this is private property. You can't." But the officer's voice cut him off. "We received multiple reports of assault and disturbance. Step back, sir." All eyes swung toward Marcus, his phone still in hand, recording the entire sequence of violence. The officers glanced at him, then at William, then at Kesha, who stood tall in the center of the chaos. William's chest heaved, eyes wide. For the first time, the man who thought he owned the city looked small, trapped, powerless. And the cuffs gleamed in the officer's hand. Cliffhanger, the handcuffs clicked, metallic and final, echoing louder than the orchestra ever had. The sight of William Thompson, once a titan of Manhattan's skyline, being turned by the shoulders, wrists bound, was something no guest in that room would ever forget. The marble floor that had once reflected his power now reflected his downfall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by the shrill cries of Victoria, her perfect facade fracturing into panic. "You can't arrest him here. Do you know who he is?" she shrieked, clutching at the officer's sleeves like a drowning woman. But the officers were unmoved. One recited his rights in a steady voice, the other pressed a palm against William's back as he struggled. "You'll regret this," William spat, twisting against the grip. "I am this city, you're nothing without me." No one stepped in to defend him, not the partners who had toasted him hours earlier, not the investors who had once hung on his every word, not the guests who had laughed at his cruel jokes. Phones were raised, but not in support, only to record his humiliation, to share it with the world. Kesha stood motionless, her breath steady, her eyes unblinking. She had seen him at his most powerful, his most cruel. Now she saw him stripped bare, sweat-soaked, trembling, pathetic, and she felt nothing but a strange, quiet peace. Jonathan's gaze met hers. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no echo of his father's cruelty, only shame and something else, respect. And as William's shouts grew fainter, drowned by the shuffle of uniforms, Kesha knew her story was no longer hers alone. The world was about to witness it. The ballroom exhaled once the doors closed behind the police. Conversations burst to life, frantic, overlapping. Some guests whispered in panic about contracts and stock prices, others about scandal and social ruin. But many simply stared at Kesha, not as a maid, not even as a dancer, but as a mirror reflecting their own complicity. Marcus, his forearm bandaged hastily with a napkin, approached her. His phone still clutched in his other hand, its red recording light glowing like a beacon. He nodded once. "It's all here. Every word, every threat. The world will see it exactly as it happened." Kesha's voice was soft but firm, "Then let it see." And it did. By dawn, the footage spread across social media. The headline was irresistible. "Millionaire humiliates Maid, discovers she's a lost ballet legend." Within hours, it was everywhere. Clips of William's sneers, of his drunken bet, of his violent outburst, of Kesha's extraordinary dance, all replayed millions of times. Some videos froze on the moment she leapt across the ballroom floor, apron flaring like wings. Others slowed the moment she locked eyes with William after her final pose. But all carried the same narrative: arrogance undone, prejudice exposed, dignity reclaimed. Talk shows dissected it, news anchors replayed it, bloggers, influencers, critics all weighed in. And for the first time in 15 years, the name Kesha Merrow trended worldwide, but the storm had two sides. For William, it was ruin. By mid-morning, 3 major contracts had been canceled. Stock in Thompson Holdings plunged, wiping out millions. board members scheduled an emergency meeting without him. His name was no longer spoken with respect but with disgust, disgust that spread like fire. Victoria, humiliated beyond repair, fled to Europe within days. The glittering queen of ballroom became nothing more than a footnote in a scandal too large to hide. And Jonathan, for the first time in his life, he was free. Free from his father's shadow, his manipulation, his threats. But freedom came with cost. Investors questioned whether he had the strength to lead, whether the Thompson legacy could be salvaged from ashes. He didn't care. His eyes had shifted to something else, someone else. Kesha. While William's empire collapsed, Kesha's life was being rebuilt by strangers who had never even met her. Ballet companies sent offers. Theaters begged her to return. Publishers wanted her story. Movie producers reached out. But what touched her most was a handwritten letter from a group of children at the community school where she had quietly volunteered before cleaning ballrooms. "We saw your dance. You showed us we don't have to stay small. Will you teach us?" Her hands trembled as she held the paper, tears filling her eyes. For 15 years she had lived in shadows, hiding from the stage from herself. Now the world had thrust her back into the light. The question was, did she want it? That evening, as twilight bled across the Manhattan skyline, Kesha stood on the rooftop of her small apartment. The city stretched before her, alive with lights, horns, sirens, and the endless hum of ambition. Once, this city had taken everything from her. Tonight, it had returned it tenfold. A knock on her door pulled her from thought. Jonathan stood there, dressed not in the polished arrogance of an heir, but simply humbly, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers awkwardly in his hand. "I didn't know what else to bring," he said softly, "but thank you for everything, for standing when no one else would." Kesha studied him. He wasn't his father. His apology wasn't performance. His respect wasn't pity. Still, she hesitated. She had spent too long being underestimated, defined by others. She couldn't let her story become someone else's again. "You don't owe me flowers," she said finally. "You owe the world better than what your father taught you." Jonathan nodded. "Then let me prove I can be better." Kesha's gaze softened, but she didn't answer. Not yet. Behind them, the city lights pulsed like a heartbeat. The storm had passed, but its aftermath had only just begun. Because while William Thompson's empire was collapsing in real time, another question loomed over Kesha's rebirth. Would she step back into the world that once destroyed her, or choose a new stage altogether? Cliffhanger: the city never sleeps, but sometimes it holds its breath. Weeks had passed since the ballroom scandal shattered across screens worldwide, but Manhattan still buzzed with the aftershocks. Newspapers called it the fall of a king. Social media turned Kesha's name into a rallying cry. Posters of her mid-leap, apron flaring like wings, appeared on walls in Harlem, Queens, even across oceans in Paris and London. She wasn't just a dancer anymore, she was a symbol. But symbols come with choices. And tonight, standing before the Lincoln Center stage she had once commanded, Kesha felt the weight of that choice pressing down. The theater's director had begged her to return, offering a gala, a revival, the chance to reclaim the crown she had lost 15 years ago. The stage was hers if she wanted it. Inside, the lights glowed, the velvet curtains shimmered, the empty seats waited, but her hands trembled as she touched the door. Could she step back into the spotlight that had once broken her? Did she even want to? Behind her, footsteps echoed. Jonathan approached quietly, his tie loose, his expression stripped of any corporate polish. "You don't have to go in," he said softly, "not if it feels like chains instead of freedom." Kesha looked at him, the city's neon lights reflected in her eyes. She wasn't the maid in an apron anymore. She wasn't the broken ballerina either. She was something new. The question was what. Meanwhile, William's collapse was complete. Headlines tracked his freefall, his resignation forced, his properties sold off, his reputation shredded. Investors abandoned him. Victoria filed for divorce, leaving the country in quiet shame. Photographs of William showed a man gaunt, unshaven, clutching papers outside a courthouse. The once golden lion of Manhattan had become a cautionary tale. And yet Kesha didn't gloat. When reporters shoved microphones in her face, asking how it felt to bring down one of the city's richest men, she only said, "I didn't bring him down, he destroyed himself. I just refused to stay silent." Her humility only amplified the story. She wasn't vengeance, she was resilience. But the offers kept pouring in. Book deals, ballet tour, movie rights. The world wanted her everywhere at once, and at the center of it all, the community school children wrote again. "Will you teach us, even if it's just in the gym after class? We just want to dance." Kesha held the note to her chest. It was written in messy crayon, some words misspelled, but it carried more weight than any contract. Because that was the choice, reclaim the stage for herself or build a stage for others, she made her decision quietly. 6 months later, the grand opening of the Kesha Marrow Center for the Arts filled Manhattan with a different kind of energy. The ribbon was cut not by politicians or tycoons, but by children in worn sneakers, their laughter brighter than any chandelier. The building wasn't as grand as Lincoln Center, but its walls echoed with possibility. Inside were studios, classrooms, spaces for children who had never dreamed they belonged on a stage. Donations had poured in from strangers worldwide, but the first seed money came from Jonathan Thompson, no longer his father's shadow, but a man determined to build something better. Reporters filled the sidewalks, snapping photos as Kesha guided a group of children through their first clumsy steps. She corrected posture with gentle hands, clapped in rhythm, laughed when they stumbled. Her joy was not in ovations from elites, it was in watching a child discover their own grace. Jonathan stood in the back, flowers in his hand again, but he didn't approach yet. He only watched, knowing her story wasn't his to claim. And Marcus, bandage long gone from his arm, stood by the door with quiet pride, his phone in his pocket. The same phone that had captured the moment William's empire crumbled, the same phone that had carried Kesha's resurrection to the world. That night after the children left, the center stood quiet, bathed in the glow of street lamps. Kesha walked alone through the empty studio, her reflection stretched in mirrors, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. For the first time, she felt whole, not because she had regained the stage, but because she had chosen her own. Jonathan entered quietly, placing the flowers on the piano. "Dinner?" he asked gently, as though asking permission to step into her world. Kesha smiled, not the smile of someone saved, but of someone who had saved herself. "Dinner," she replied. And as they walked out together, the city lights shimmering above, the lesson of the ballroom lingered like a final note of music. True nobility isn't inherited. It isn't bought. It isn't shouted over champagne glasses. It is revealed when cruelty meets dignity, when arrogance meets grace, when prejudice collides with truth and loses. Kesha's revenge had never been William Thompson's downfall. It was this, a room full of children who would never again believe they were too small to dance. Her story wasn't just survival, it was transformation. And for the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt alive. The end.